Episode 9, Part 2, From Vision to Reality, Implementing Post-Reparations Futures. Welcome back to Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei, Executive Director of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, the educational arm of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, joined once again by my co-host, Brother Simeon. Let us first pour libations. We pour libation to the Creator of the heavens and the earth, and to our African ancestors and ancestresses who not only dreamed of our freedom, but actively built the foundations upon which we stand. To those who transformed vision into reality through concrete action and sustained commitment. We pour to the African ancestors and ancestresses who created alternative institutions, governance systems, and ways of living and being that prefigurated. To the African ancestors and ancestresses who created alternative institutions, governance systems, and ways of living and being that prefigured the liberation that we continue to build. We pour to the community builders, the institution creators, the ones who translated dreams into brick and mortar, policy and practice. To those who understood that preparation for reparations requires both imagination and implementation. We pour. May our words honour their works. May our actions continue their legacy. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo.
Greetings, family. In part 1 of this series, we explored how Black radical imagination has shaped reparation thought and examined vision as a mobilizing force in liberation movements. We discussed how figures like Marcus Garvey, Claudia Jones, and contemporary movements like the Alliance of Sahel States have used imagination to envision transformation beyond the constraints of colonial systems.
Today, in part 2, we turn to the practical questions that are central to Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations. How do communities cultivate visionary capacity? What concrete methods can our listeners implement to develop collective imagination in service of liberation? And perhaps most importantly, how do we move from imagination to actual implementation, translating dreams into the concrete realities that reparations demands?
Throughout our discussion in part 1, we emphasized that vision isn't separate from strategy and action, but integral to effective movement building. Today, we'll explore how this integration works in practice, offering tools that communities can use immediately to begin developing their own visionary capacity, tools that are essential for genuine preparation for reparations.
As we discussed in part 1, this connects directly to our podcast's central theme, Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations. But preparation isn't passive waiting, it's active building. Part of that preparation involves not just developing our collective capacity to envision the post-reparations world we're fighting to create, but actually beginning to build it through concrete action guided by transformative vision. This is how we prepare ourselves to effect, secure, implement, and maximize reparations in our lifetime.
Practical approaches to cultivating visionary capacity. Let's move to practical approaches for cultivating visionary capacity in our communities. What concrete methods can our listeners implement to develop collective imagination in service of liberation? I'm particularly interested in approaches that build on existing community strengths rather than requiring extensive new resources.
I want to share 4 specific approaches that communities can adapt to their particular context. Popular education methodologies that unlock collective imagination, arts-based approaches to envisioning post-reparations futures, scenario planning as a practical visioning tool, and intergenerational dialogue that connects ancestral wisdom with future possibilities.
Let's start with our education methodologies. These seem particularly relevant because they're explicitly designed to develop what Paulo Freire called critical consciousness, the capacity to analyze current conditions while imagining alternatives.
Popular education, as developed by practitioners like Paulo Freire and adapted within African liberation movements, provides structured processes for communities to analyse current conditions while imagining alternatives. Unlike conventional education, that often reinforces acceptance of existing arrangements, or should we say miseducation, popular education explicitly aims to develop critical consciousness and imaginative capacity.
One methodology that seems particularly powerful is the problem-posing approach, where communities identify contradictions in current systems and collectively develop alternatives that resolve these contradictions. This moves beyond simply critiquing what exists to actively envisioning what could replace it.
Exactly. For example, a community might analyse how current educational systems reproduce colonial knowledge hierarchies, then envision learning spaces that centre African epistemologies and liberation pedagogy. The process isn't just analytical, but it's generative. That is, creating new possibilities through collective reflection.
The coding and decoding methodology also seems relevant here, when communities use images, stories, or scenarios representing current realities to stimulate both analysis and visioning. This recognizes that imagination often works through symbolic and narrative forms rather than purely abstract analysis.
Yes, for example, examining the quote-unquote code of how land is currently distributed might lead to imagining alternative land relations based on stewardship rather than ownership. The Highlander Research and Education Center in the United States provides excellent resources on these methodologies, as does the work of Paulo Freire and the late Kenyan philosopher Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who recently transitioned to the ancestors. His concept of decolonizing the mind emphasizes the liberation of imagination from colonial constraints and remains essential to our liberation work. Ngugi understood that colonialism's greatest weapon was the colonization of consciousness itself, making oppressed people dream in the colonizer's language and frameworks. His insistence on writing in Gikuyu and championing African languages was itself an act of imaginative decolonization, demonstrating that true liberation requires reclaiming the very tools of thought and expression.
Arts-based approaches seem particularly important for accessing forms of knowledge that conventional political discourse often excludes. How do these methods tap into cultural traditions and creative capacities to expand what's politically imaginable?
So, arts-based approaches recognise that imagination often operates through non-linear, symbolic, and embodied forms that conventional political discourse doesn't really accommodate. These approaches tap into cultural traditions, emotional knowledge, and creative capacities that expand what's politically imaginable.
One particularly powerful method is cultural memory work that recovers artistic traditions disrupted by colonization and uses them to imagine post-colonial futures. This isn't about romanticizing the past, but about accessing wisdom traditions that can inform contemporary liberation struggles.
Yes, for example, the Sankofa principle that we've discussed previously involves reclaiming ancestral artistic practices not as museum pieces, but as living traditions that can generate new visions and relationships. This work recognizes that colonization deliberately disrupted cultural transmission as a form of social control.
The concept of visionary fiction, developed by scholar activists like Relida Emerisha and Adrienne Marie Brown, also seem crucial here. Unlike mainstream science fiction that often reproduces colonial assumptions, visionary fiction consciously explores liberatory social arrangements, technologies, and relationships.
Yes, and what makes their work particularly powerful is how it demonstrates that imagination is a collective practice. Instead of individual authors creating fantasy worlds, visionary fiction involves communities writing stories about their own liberation, describing in detail what their neighborhoods, relationships, governance, and daily life would look like after securing reparations and freedom. For instance, the anthology Octavia's Brood brings together stories by activists and organisers who use speculative fiction to imagine the worlds that they're fighting to create, from prison abolition to environmental justice to economic transformation.
Performance-based methods like the theatre of the oppressed, developed by Augusta Boal, seem particularly valuable because they engage embodied knowledge. This breaks through purely intellectual analysis to involve emotional and semantic. This breaks through purely intellectual analysis to involve emotional and semantic understandings in the visionary process. For example, a community might act out a scene where they've been confronted by police harassment, then replay the scene multiple times with different community members stepping in to try alternative responses, not just discussing what could be done differently, but physically experiencing various forms of resistance and mutual aid.
Yes, and what's exactly important is how these methods have been adapted in various African contexts to incorporate indigenous performance traditions and community storytelling practices. This creates space for visioning that honours both the analytical framework Boal developed and the rich cultural practices that our communities already use for reflection and imagination.
Scenario planning seems like it could be particularly useful for reparations movements, given the uncertainty about how these processes will unfold politically. How does liberation-oriented scenario planning differ from corporate strategic planning approaches?
Scenario planning has corporate applications, yes, but it was developed within liberation movements as a tool for navigating uncertain futures while maintaining strategic vision. Unlike corporate approaches focused on institutional survival, liberation-oriented scenario planning focuses on identifying pathways to transformative goals through changing conditions.
This involves creating multiple narrative scenarios about how conditions might evolve, then developing strategic approaches for advancing liberation goals within each scenario. For example, a reparations campaign might develop 3 scenarios. One where government hostility increases and resources become scarce, another where limited institutional support emerges but there's strings attached, and a third where broader social movements create openings for more radical demands. For each scenario, the community would plan different tactics while maintaining the same transformative vision.
Exactly. For example, a community might develop scenarios ranging from increased repression to partial reforms, identifying how to build power and advance vision under each condition. This develops strategic flexibility while maintaining principled vision adapting tactics to changing conditions without abandoning the more transformative goals.
The Stop the Maangamizi campaign demonstrates this approach well, articulating a clear vision of Ma'at Ubuntuman while developing multiple concrete pathways for its advancement. From establishing local Ma'at Zoidziduras to building autonomous zones to advocating for formal recognition of the Maangamizi and reparatory justice through mechanisms like apsitage. This recognises that no single pathway is guaranteed and that strategic flexibility is essential.
And the apsitage being the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. Yes. And finally, how does intergenerational dialogue support visionary capacity, in your opinion, Brother Simeon?
Through intergenerational dialogue that recognises vision exists across time, connecting ancestral wisdom with present struggles and future possibilities. It challenges both on critical nostalgia for the past and dismissal of traditional knowledge as irrelevant to contemporary challenges. The temporal dimension of Ubuntu, I am because we are, extends across generations, not just contemporary communities.
This approach involves creating structured spaces where elders share not just historical information, but the worldviews and values that informed earlier liberation struggles, while youth contribute new analysis and approaches emerging from their contemporary conditions. Together, they develop vision that's both rooted in historical experience and responsive to emerging possibilities.
The Southern African concept of Ubuntu that I mentioned, I am because we are, extends across time as well as space, recognizing that our present existence and future possibilities are connected to ancestors whose struggles made our lives possible. Intergenerational dialogue honors this temporal dimension of community by bringing together generational perspectives into conversation.
Practical methodologies that can be incorporated into Ma'at Zoidziduras include testimony circles, where elders share experiences of both oppression and resistance, knowledge retention initiatives that document traditional practices and philosophies with contemporary applications, and vision councils that bring multiple generations together to develop shared goals and strategies. These approaches strengthen the Ma'at Zoidziduras by ensuring they function as spaces where ancestral wisdom directly informs contemporary visioning work.
These approaches seem adaptable to various contexts and resource levels. Are there examples of them being successfully implemented in reparations movements globally that demonstrate this adaptability?
Yes, and these examples demonstrate how visioning methodologies can be adapted to diverse contexts. So in Colombia, African Colombian communities have used cultural memory practices to recover traditional ecological knowledges disrupted by violence and displacement, informing their vision of reparations that includes territorial autonomy and cultural restoration.
In Jamaica, the Rastafari community has used arts-based approaches to articulate the vision of reparations that includes repatriation, cultural reclamation, and ecological restoration. Visioning work that directly informed the development of the CARICOM 10-point plan. This shows how grassroots visioning can influence formal policy frameworks.
In South Africa, intergenerational dialogue between veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle and so-called post-apartheid youth movements has generated new visions of reparatory justice that address both historical harms and contemporary manifestations of structural violence.
In the United States, NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which originated the push for reparations legislation, and the National African American Reparations Commission have employed scenario planning to develop multiple pathways for advancing HR 40. the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act, while simultaneously building community-based reparations initiatives that don't depend on federal action.
These examples show that visioning methodologies aren't abstract exercises, but practical tools for developing the clarity, commitment, and strategic flexibility needed for effective reparations organising.
How can our listeners begin implementing these approaches in their own context, particularly if they're working with limited resources or in communities not yet organised around reparations specifically? The key seems to be starting with existing strengths and practices.
Yes, each of these approaches can be adapted to various contexts and resource levels. For popular education methodologies, start with simple problem-posing discussions using the Freyrian question, why are things this way? And how could they be different? This requires no special resources, but begins developing the critical and creative thinking essential to visioning work.
For arts-based approaches, the key is to begin with whatever creative practices are already present in your community. Music, storytelling, dance, visual arts. The adaptation involves using these to explicitly explore visionary questions like, what would our community look like with genuine reparatory justice? Or, what is the role of education in repairing the world?
For scenario planning, start with a simple exercise where community members identify 3 possible futures. 1 where conditions worsen, 1 where they improve slightly, and 1 where transformative change occurs. Discuss how to build power and advance vision under each scenario, developing strategic flexibility while maintaining principled goals.
For intergenerational dialogue, create informal spaces where elders and youth discuss their experiences, analyses, and hopes regarding community challenges. Frame these conversations around the Sankofa principle, reaching back to move forward, explicitly connecting historical knowledge to contemporary possibilities.
These starter activities can be incorporated into existing community gatherings, requiring minimal additional resources, while beginning to develop the visionary capacity that more elaborate processes can later expand.
And how do these visioning processes connect to the concrete action steps we've discussed in previous episodes, like establishing Maangamizi Educational or participating in Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings? The integration seems crucial to prevent visioning from becoming disconnected from material struggle.
These visioning processes aren't separate from other reparations work. They're integral to it. Maangamizi Educational incorporate visioning through their focus on not just documenting harm, but developing community-generated solutions. The Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings, or the PARGs, like the one that we discussed took place in Bristol in May, create space for collective imagination through their groundings methodology that values every participant's perspective on both problems and possibilities. The key is to integrate visioning work into all aspects of reparations organising, rather than treating it as a separate or preliminary phase. So, when documenting Maangamizi experiences, simultaneously explore what healing and repair would truly mean. When organising to challenge institutions, articulate not just what you're opposing, but what you're fighting to create. This integration ensures that vision remains connected to material struggle rather than becoming abstract utopianism. It recognises what Audre Lorde meant when she said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." That challenging colonial systems requires not just critique, but the imagination to envision and create alternatives.
Actualizing visions, from imagination to implementation. We've explored approaches for cultivating visionary capacity, but how do communities move from imagination to actual implementation? What does the process of actualizing visions look like in practice? This seems like where many movements struggle, translating dreams into concrete realities.
Yes, that's a crucial question. Visionary capacity is essential, but it must be paired with implementation strategies that translate dreams into concrete realities. I want to share examples of communities that have successfully moved from imagination to implementation, along with practical tools for this translation process.
Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi seems like a powerful example here. They've implemented a vision of economic democracy through concrete cooperative enterprises, translating broad principles about solidarity economy into specific worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts, and people's assemblies.
Exactly. What makes Cooperation Jackson's approach particularly instructive is how they're connecting visionary principles to concrete institutions. They didn't just articulate a vision of economic democracy, they developed specific cooperative businesses, legal structures, training programs, and governance systems that embody this vision. This demonstrates how implementation requires translating broad principles into specific organizational forms and practices.
Are there similar examples related more directly to reparations that show this vision to implementation process?
Well, I'd say Cooperation Jackson, they might argue is, reparations in practice in terms of their approach, in terms of self-repair. However, there is also the Black Land and Liberation Initiative in the US, which provides, for me, an important example. Their vision of land reparations emerged from analysis of how land theft continues to shape racial inequality. Rather than waiting for government action, they've implemented this vision through a network of land reclamation projects where communities reoccupy and transform vacant properties into urban farms, cultural centres, and also housing, social housing.
Wow. What's powerful about their approach is how they combine immediate land reclamation with longer-term vision. Each reclaimed space serves both immediate needs for food, housing, and cultural expression, and advances the broader vision of land reparations. This demonstrates how implementation often involves creating demonstration sites that prefigure the larger transformation sought.
Another powerful example comes from Quilombola communities in Brazil, who have translated their vision of territorial sovereignty into practical governance systems. Their vision of reparations includes not just legal recognition of land rights, but the restoration of traditional decision-making processes and knowledge systems. They've implemented this through community governance councils that combine ancestral governance practices with contemporary legal strategies, creating hybrid systems that secure both material resources and cultural continuity.
What practical tools can communities use to move from vision to implementation? This translation process seems to require specific methodologies and frameworks to prevent vision from remaining abstract.
Several practical frameworks can guide this translation process. One effective approach is the vision to action planning method, which breaks visionary goals into concrete projects with specific objectives, timelines, resources, and responsibilities. This prevents vision from remaining abstract by creating accountability for implementation.
For example, if a community envisions educational reparations through African-centered learning, a vision to action plan might include immediate projects like weekend supplementary schools, medium-term goals like curriculum development partnerships with existing institutions, and longer-term objectives like establishing independent educational institutions. Each component has specific tasks, responsible persons, resources needed, and evaluation metrics.
Another valuable tool is community and power mapping that helps communities understand their own assets and capacity through being in relationship and community while identifying power relationships in their context. This includes mapping community strengths and resources, potential supporters, those who may oppose community goals, and those whose position might shift depending on strategy. By analysing these relationships, communities can develop targeted strategies for implementing their vision despite inevitable resistance.
Resource assessment and development is also essential, helping communities identify what assets they already control and what additional resources they need to secure. This isn't just about money, it's about knowledge, relationships, cultural assets, and organizational capacity. Often, implementation begins with pooling existing community resources before seeking external support.
So, what kinds of supportive institutions would you say that communities need to develop for sustained implementation, Brother Simeon?
Well, sustained implementation requires building supportive institutions in three key areas that reinforce each other: education and training, cultural production and knowledge preservation, and then economic foundations. They create the infrastructure needed to maintain visionary work over time.
Education and training institutions develop the skills and perspectives needed to implement visionary projects. For example, community-led political education programs provide organising training specifically designed to support vision implementation. Similarly, African Heritage Community Self-Repair educational initiatives create spaces for learning the practical skills needed to affect and secure community self-determination.
Cultural production and knowledge preservation institutions sustain the values and perspectives that underlie visionary work. These include community archives that document both oppression and resistance, cultural centres that nurture artistic expression aligned with liberation value, and media platforms that amplify community voices and visions.
Economic foundations provide the material resources needed for sustained implementation. These might include community development credit unions that pool and circulate resources within communities, cooperative enterprises that generate sustainable livelihoods while embodying alternative economic relations, and reparations funds controlled by communities themselves rather than external institutions. These would be reparations funds in terms of what we refer to as restituted resources.
Okay, and what challenges typically arise in implementation, and how do communities address them? Understanding these obstacles seems crucial for developing realistic implementation strategies.
Yes, implementation inevitably faces challenges, including resource limitations, resistance from established power structures, and internal tensions and divisions within movements. Successful implementation requires strategies for addressing these challenges.
Resource limitations are often addressed through creative approaches that maximize existing community assets while gradually building capacity. For example, many implementation projects begin with volunteer labor and donated space before developing more sustainable resource models. Time banking and mutual aid systems allow communities to accomplish significant work even with limited financial resources.
Resistance from established power structures requires both defensive and offensive strategies. Defensively, communities must protect their initiatives from disruption or co-optation, often through legal support networks, security protocols, and media strategies that create public accountability. Offensively, strategic campaigns can create political costs for opposing community initiatives or secure formal protection for them.
Internal tensions are inevitable in any collective process and require democratic mechanisms for resolution. Successful implementation projects develop clear decision-making processes, conflict resolution protocols, and mechanisms for addressing power imbalances within movements. These internal government systems are as important as external strategies for sustained implementation.
Okay, Brother Simeon, so how would you say communities measure progress in implementing their visions, especially when conventional metrics might not capture the transformative dimensions?
Well, this is a critical question. Transformative work requires transformative evaluation approaches that reflect community values and goals rather than imposed metrics. So, successful implementation involves developing community-defined indicators of success that measure what matters to the community itself.
These often include qualitative dimensions that conventional metrics ignore, such as the restoration of cultural practices, the strengthening of community relationships, or the development even of political consciousness. For example, the Happiness Index developed by the Gross National Happiness Centre measures progress not just in material terms, but through cultural vitality, psychological well-being, and community strength.
Effective evaluation also incorporates feedback loops that allow continuous adaptation based on community experience. Rather than rigid adherence to initial plans, successful implementation involves regular reflection on what's working, what's not, and how strategies might need to evolve. This creates a dynamic relationship between vision and implementation where each continually informs the other.
All this connects directly to the Ma'atu Man in Ubuntu Dunia vision that's central to the Stop the Maangamizi campaign. The Ma'atu Man in Ubuntu Dunia vision provides a comprehensive framework for understanding how local implementations connects to broader change and transformation. Rather than seeing individual projects as isolated efforts, Ma'atu Man helps communities understand their work as contributing to a Pan-African union of communities that is emerging.
This means that when a community establishes a Ma'at Zoezidura or implements a cooperative enterprise, they're not just addressing local needs, but participating in the construction of new social relations that prefigure Ma'at Ubuntuman. Each local implementation becomes a building block in the larger vision while having immediate value for the community involved.
Exactly, and this connection prevents both localism, where communities become isolated in their own local struggles, and abstract universalism, where global vision lacks concrete grounding in communities' lived realities and experiences. Ma'atu Man, as a vision and the practical work being done to secure it, provides the connective tissue that links diverse implementation efforts into a coherent movement for change and transformation.
This also helps address the challenge of scale, how individual communities can participate in transformation that necessarily involves changing global systems of power. Through networks of autonomous but coordinated implementations, communities can achieve together what none could accomplish alone.
As we conclude this two-part exploration of imagination and vision in reparations work, I want to emphasise what we've discussed isn't separate from the concrete organising we've explored throughout this podcast series. It's integral to all effective liberation work.
That's a crucial point. The capacity to envision alternatives isn't luxury for movements to pursue after addressing immediate needs. It's fundamental to understanding what we're fighting for and why sustained struggle is necessary. Without vision, movements become trapped in endless reaction to oppressive systems rather than actively creating alternatives.
Throughout our discussion in both parts, we've explored how imagination functions as both inspiration and strategy, providing the hope needed to sustain long-term struggle while offering concrete guidance for immediate action. From the historical examples of the Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and Claudia Jones to contemporary movements like the efforts being made in the Alliance of Sahel States, visionary capacity has been essential to effective liberation organising.
The practical approaches we've discussed, popular education, arts-based methods, scenario planning, and intergenerational dialogue aren't just techniques, but ways of developing collective capacity to break free from the constraints that colonial systems place on our imagination. They help communities remember that current arrangements aren't inevitable and that alternatives are both possible and achievable.
And the implementation examples from Cooperation Jackson to Quilombola Community Governance Councils demonstrate that vision isn't abstract, but leads to concrete transformation when paired with strategic organising and sustained commitment. These examples show that communities don't have to wait for permission to begin implementing their visions of liberation.
This connects directly to our podcast theme, Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations. As we've seen today, part of that preparation involves developing our collective capacity to envision the post-reparations world we're fighting to create, not just as a distant goal, but as a guide for immediate action. When we build our infrastructure, skills, and relationships needed to implement our visions, we are actively preparing ourselves to receive and maximize reparations.
Exactly. When we cultivate visionary capacity, we prepare ourselves to engage with reparations processes as opportunities for transformation rather than merely compensation. We develop the clarity needed to distinguish between reforms that advance liberation and those that only reinforce and stabilise oppression. And we build the hope and commitment needed to sustain struggle through inevitable challenges and setbacks. This is what true preparation for reparations entails. Not passive waiting, but active building.
This connection to Ma'at Ubuntuman that runs throughout the series provides a concrete example of how vision functions in reparations organizing. It's not just an inspiring slogan, but a framework that guides decisions about anything from how we organize Ma'at Zoidziduras to how we engage with international solidarity movements. This demonstrates how Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves, requires both imagination and concrete action.
Yes. Okay, Brother Simeon, what would you say to listeners who might feel that focusing on imagination and vision is premature when communities are facing immediate survival challenges?
I would emphasize that this isn't an either-or proposition. Vision doesn't replace immediate survival work, it transforms how we understand and pursue it. When communities have clear vision of the world they're fighting to create, it changes how they approach everything from mutual aid to political advocacy all the way through to cultural work. It helps ensure that survival strategies also advance liberation rather than just reproducing dependency.
And vision provides the resilience needed to sustain survival work itself. When people understand their immediate struggles as part of a larger project of transformation, it creates meaning and purpose that enables continued action even under difficult conditions. As our ancestors overstood, vision is itself a survival strategy.
And for our listeners who want to begin developing visionary capacity in their communities, what would you recommend as first steps?
I'd say start with the simple exercises that we've discussed. Problem posing conversations about why things are the way they are and how they could be different. Use whatever creative practices are already present in your community to explore questions about what reparations and liberation would actually look like in your own context. This is fundamental preparation work. Most importantly, connect visioning work to concrete action. The most powerful vision sessions are those that lead directly to practical steps, even small ones, towards implementing what's been imagined. This prevents vision from becoming escapism while building the experience and confidence needed for larger implementations. This is how we practice and effect Yɛresiesie. We prepare ourselves through doing, that is, taking action.
And remember that this work is inherently collective. The individual inspiration that might come from reading or reflection becomes transformative power only when it's shared, developed, and acted upon with others. The Black radical imagination emerges through community process, not individual genius. This collective preparation is essential for effective reparations work.
In our next episode, we'll explore practical frameworks for community-led reparations implementation, examining how communities can begin implementing reparative justice without waiting for government action or institutional permission. We'll connect the visionary frameworks discussed in this two-part episode to concrete strategies for community-controlled reparations initiatives, showing how preparation becomes implementation.
And until then, I encourage you, our listeners, to engage in visionary practice, not as an escape from present realities, but as a tool for transforming them. Remember that every liberation movement in history required people to imagine possibilities that didn't exist and then organize to make them real. This is the essence of preparing ourselves for reparations.
This is Esther Xosei
And Brother Simeon,
on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that when we cultivate our collective capacity to envision liberation and translate it into concrete action, we are practicing Yɛresiesie. We are preparing ourselves for the transformation and the reparations our communities deserve, and building the foundation to effect, secure, and maximize the reparations that are our birthright. Thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all of your support today.